It was a fairy tale wedding, but for Claire Morris, there would be no happy ending.
He decided he was going to stage a road traffic collision and effectively set the vehicle on fire, with his wife in the passenger seat incapacitated, and effectively burn her to death.
Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Malcolm Webster as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? Claire Morris was a happy little girl. She was close to her family.
We've been a close family since we lost my dad when we were 7 and 9 respectively, and Claire was more the practical person. She'd help around the home a bit more. She was gardener and that sort of thing. And she was a good sister.
But for the little boy who would grow up to marry Claire, life was less simple.
It does seem that Malcolm Webster had quite a strange childhood. I don't think it's one that we would describe as particularly normal or even functioning incredibly well. His dad was in quite a powerful job in the police force. He was head of the fraud squad, and it's said by people that he was an incredibly controlling man, and he ruled his family. And I think Malcolm especially felt that he was at the bottom, the very bottom of the pecking order.
He stood out for all of the wrong reasons. He was not like other boys.
There were some behavioural difficulties noted with Malcolm Webster. From when he was a child, he was known to be attention-seeking. He always wanted attention, but he always seemed to want to get his own way as well. And he would often fake illnesses, and he would pretend to faint, and that probably got him the attention that he was craving at the time.
There are many occasions where we've got evidence that even as a youngster, again going back to his teenage years, where he'd feigned the fact that he had a brain tumour, a life-threatening illness.
Webster struggled to carve out a place for himself, but finally settled on a career.
He decided that he wanted to train to be a nurse. His mother had been a nurse, and I suppose it's not that surprising given that he was always ill himself or feigning illness himself.
It was this career choice that brought him into contact with Claire Morris.
Claire was a nurse. She'd been a nurse for some years. She'd done all training in London. She'd put her career as an important thing, and she put that in front of relationships. She wanted to get qualified as a state registered nurse, and then I think she specialised in eye care.
The pair met at a house party in London and hit it off immediately.
She was sharing a house in Dulwich with some friends, and I believe that she met Malcolm at a party, after which the next day he came down and was showering her with flowers and gifts and what have you. And he seemed a gentleman. He seemed the sort of person that Claire would be interested in, and it didn't take long for her to fall for him.
The couple moved to rural Scotland, and in the early 90s, they married. Claire's brother vividly recalls the happy day.
It was a traditional Scottish wedding, had a bit of class to it. Not so much a disco afterwards as a ceilidh, which is good fun, all prancing about, doing silly dances, and they thoroughly approved it.
The wedding day appeared perfect, but Webster's vow till death us do part masked a more sinister motive.
It seems that after they got married in 1993, that's when Webster really starts to escalate things. It's like, you know, he's got the marriage now, he's safe in that relationship. It means he's got entitlements from that relationship. And we see during that time that Claire had 10 life insurance policies against her life and a big mortgage protection policy. So it seems that even before they were married, and definitely after they got married, he had a plan that this marriage was not going to last.
Malcolm suggested Claire make a will too.
About 2 years in, he gets Claire to change her will, and he is the sole beneficiary. He gets absolutely everything. Probably didn't raise any red flags for her, because that's not necessarily an unusual thing for a committed couple to do.
Claire was deeply in love with Webster. Her brother noticed the intense hold that he had over her.
Well, there were times when Malcolm told her to take her hands out of her pockets, and she did. If I'd told that to Claire, she'd have told me to clear off. He'd managed to sort of wind this spell over her, really, but at the time, he wound that spell over all of us.
By spring 1994, Claire's health was deteriorating.
On many occasions in the early months of their marriage, friends, family of Claire noticed, indeed Claire herself was concerned that she was undergoing periods of blackouts, dizziness. Clearly she knew herself that there was something wrong within her, and Malcolm, he would sideline that and he would minimise it and trivialise the symptoms that she was suffering from. But friends and family, she visited her GP, they thought it was perhaps epilepsy.
She's tired, she's confused, she's forgetting things, and she doesn't know what's going on. That's terrifying for her. But there is her husband saying, don't worry, rely on me, and I will take care of it all, because you are clearly not capable.
There was much Claire didn't know about her new husband. She had no idea he was secretly feeding her sedatives.
He was using a combination of epilepsy drugs and sleeping tablets, whose effect, of course, is to make you drowsy. And I don't think there's any much doubt that what he was trying to do at the very least was to cause Claire to become more malleable, more confused, more uncertain, more under his influence.
But that wasn't all. Malcolm was hiding his lifelong fascination with fire. Since his school days, he'd been a pyromaniac.
He was known in his friendship group, or with the people that knew him anyway, the children that knew him, for setting fires. He would brag about his skill in setting fires.
Mid-1994, and the Websters appear a happy couple. No one is suspicious of the insurance policies taken out on Claire's life. Nobody would have guessed that Claire's pyromaniac husband had hidden several cans of petrol in the boot of their car. And Claire herself would never have imagined that to Malcolm Webster, she was of more value dead than alive. Malcolm Webster had always loved acting, and it seemed he didn't know when to stop.
His whole adult life was nothing other than a performance. He was into amateur drama as a young man, and I think he played that through for the rest of his days.
His thespian abilities were to stand him in good stead as he embarked on a plan to kill. In May 1994, Webster bought a new car and began researching the local roads. And on the 27th of May, just 8 months after their wedding day, tragedy struck.
The circumstances on the night were that he enticed his wife to join him on an unnecessary journey from their farmhouse to the city of Aberdeen, some 15, 16 miles away, to drop off some paperwork to do with a project. So that created the reason to have to be in the vehicle at that particular time of night. And she came with him.
We don't know what was going through Webster's mind when he decided to kill Claire Morris, but we do know that he had planned it carefully. He had found a site where he could drive the car into a tree, and he deliberately increased the dose of medication that he gave her.
He gave her sedatives until she was unconscious, and then he carried her to the car, put the seat down so that as he was driving, nobody would be able to see that she was in the car.
One can only imagine at that point that she'd been heavily sedated, because she must have fallen asleep very quickly in the prone position in the passenger seat. So then, at the predetermined location, he drove the vehicle off the road at a very low speed, did impact with a tree with the front of the vehicle.
Webster was not finished. His boyhood fascination with fire, combined with his desire for money, meant that he had one more scene to play out.
And then he simply emptied petrol fuel in the vehicle, set it on fire, and then passers-by effectively intervened. But remarkably, he maintained at least one, possibly two of the first witnesses who arrived in the scene, because the question was asked, is there anybody else in the vehicle? And he was adamant no.
On 2 occasions he was asked if there was anybody else in the car, and he denied it. And it was only when the thing actually exploded into flames that he said that, oh, my wife's in there.
The man who had so recently promised to love and to cherish Claire now stood and watched while she burnt to death.
I have rarely heard anything more calculating in my life. If she was very lucky, she may have stayed unconscious as a result of those drugs. If she was not, then she died in agony.
What that did to Claire in the car was inhuman. Her skull was welded to the back of the chair at the front. Her bones were welded to the seat. Some wonderful fireman had to do his best to get what was left of her up and into an ambulance. It's vile.
The grieving widower played his part well. He was above suspicion, even to those he was closest to.
Up in Scotland, it's actually male members of the family that carry out the coffin. And me and a few of my cousins were doing that. And it was when they put Claire on my shoulder that I actually cracked. Yeah, the sky had collapsed for me. And I do remember that feeling quite sorry for myself, and then looking up at Malcolm, who was on my right, and thinking, wow, I've lost my sister, but he's lost his wife. And as they lowered Claire into the grave, I had a cord in this hand, which was with several other cords lowering the coffin down. And with this hand, I was holding on to Malcolm, and squeezing his hand. And I looked up at him, and he was in tears as well.
Now it was time for Webster to cash in, claiming on the insurance policies. He was finally a man of means, but the money didn't last long.
Having accumulated significant wealth and benefited from Claire's death to the sum of well over £200,000, which in the 90s was a significant, this remains a significant amount of money, but he managed to squander that very, very quickly. So within 6 months of Claire's death, he found himself in a situation where he was pretty much empty in the bank.
But Malcolm Webster knew how to get rich quick. He had a formula. Meet, marry, murder.
If he was to analyse how he'd conducted the murder of Claire, it was a perfect plan from its inception through to execution. He got away with it, so why wouldn't he do the same again?
Newly single and now stony broke, Malcolm Webster left the UK. It wouldn't be long before he met a young woman, and in 1996, they married.
All I'd heard from Mum was that he got married again. He met somebody in Saudi Arabia and he got married again. That's literally all I knew. I didn't know who it was, what nationality she was, or anything like that.
The many faces of Malcolm Webster were on display with a nurse called Felicity Drum. The couple set up home in her native New Zealand. Webster had married. Now he wanted money.
So in the relationship with Felicity, he starts to repeat the pattern, almost exactly the relationship that he had with Claire. He starts giving drugs to Felicity. She starts feeling again vulnerable and tired and fatigued. And after they got married, practically the first day after they got married, he gave her such a huge dose of sedative that she slept for 36 hours.
And so clearly, even in the very, very early stages of their relationship, he was putting his plan into action.
This is a man who didn't just not care for his wife or his wives. This is a man who cared for nobody and had not a shred of compassion for anybody.
When the unsuspecting Felicity became pregnant, the couple moved to Scotland. The pregnancy did little to put Webster off his stride.
Here was a man who was prepared to feed drugs to his wife, knowing, as a nurse, the effects they might have while she was pregnant. He was prepared to continue to feed her drugs, which might well affect the health of their baby once it was born and she was breastfeeding. And while his wife was pregnant, he almost certainly set a fire in their house, planning to kill her and their unborn child.
In the winter of 1998, a fire broke out in the Websters' home. The blaze forced the family's return to New Zealand, where they stayed with Felicity's parents. Malcolm was growing ever more desperate for money. The result? Another fire.
Certainly, during his marriage to Felicity, he had set fire or had laid fires on one occasion with his infant son and his wife and her parents, all asleep in the same house.
Having been living with Felicity's parents, the Websters were keen to move on. They planned to buy a house, but Webster was a worried man. He knew that close scrutiny by Felicity of her bank account would reveal an ugly truth. He'd been stealing. The solution? Kill Felicity.
On the morning that he attempted to murder Felicity, they were going to the bank, they were going to meet with their solicitors. And that was going to unveil the fact that he had no money in the account. He had embezzled money from her account. So he knew that that was not going to be a good meeting. So he was pretty much forced into that journey being the journey where he had to do this.
Webster's carefully laid plan was about to be undone. He had to act.
He starts to say that the steering has gone funny and he can't control it, and the car seems to veer at high speed towards a pole in the road. So it's the passenger side that's heading towards the pole, but Felicity manages to grab the steering wheel and they do come to a halt.
Incredibly, Felicity survives the crash. But just a week later, a family excursion and another attempt to kill his second wife.
To cut a long story short, he'd attempted to kill Felicity in the same way that he did kill Claire. And it was her mobile telephone going off with a call from her father that woke her up out of her stupor.
He's shouting at her to stay in the car, stay in the car. He doesn't want her to get out of the car. He's making his way to the boot where, again, he has put cans of petrol. And it seems that his intention was that he was going to set fire to the car.
This was a man who didn't just not care for this woman. He didn't care for any woman. Money and insurance policy was more important to him than anything.
The real Malcolm Webster had yet to be uncovered to the outside world. For many, he was simply a loving husband. What mistake would it take to uncover a killer? Malcolm Webster had already killed his first wife and tried to kill his second. For Felicity Drum's family, events simply didn't add up. But the evidence against Webster did.
After the crash, the car gets towed away, it's getting taken to a garage, and Felicity's sister goes to the garage, and the mechanic there tells her that there's nothing wrong with the steering at all.
The petrol cans were found in the rear of the vehicle by Felicity's brother-in-law. There was a cigarette lighter found in the console of the vehicle, which was odd because neither of them smoked. There were scrunched up newspapers, and all of this led them to think that something really suspicious had happened.
At this point, Felicity started putting the pieces together and started to make sense of some of the things that had been happening to her, that she was now seeing in a new light. So she made a statement to the police about her suspicions, and she included in that she hadn't been feeling well. So they tested her hair, and as a result of those tests, they found out that she had been drugged for quite a long period of time.
Malcolm Webster knew the game was up.
Once the house of cards began to tumble in New Zealand, and he realised that the game was up, he had to get out of there. And that's when he returned to the UK and effectively went into phase 3 of his life, if you like.
There was little police in New Zealand could do. They had suspicions, but with insufficient evidence there could be no arrest or extradition application. However, to some, there was little doubt as to Webster's intentions.
The sister, and indeed the local police, believed that Webster had tried to murder Felicity in a staged road traffic accident. But by this time, Malcolm was back in the UK.
Some years later, in 2008, Felicity's sister Jane visited the UK. She was on a course with police officers about domestic abuse. She took the opportunity to talk to one detective.
What Jane wanted to do while she was in the UK was seek out Webster and confront him. And she was angry with him. This was there'd been no justice at all, and she wanted to go and she wanted to confront him.
However, the police officer persuaded her that that was probably not a good idea. But to her credit, the police officer contacted what was then Grampian Police, and I had a conversation with her, and we agreed that we would send detectives down to England to interview Felicity's sister in full.
Police were quickly convinced by what they'd heard, and they launched Operation Field.
The circumstances of the road traffic accident involving Claire, his first wife, were remarkable, and the circumstances in New Zealand involving the road traffic accident with Felicity were remarkable, but when you overlaid and put the two together, they were compellingly striking in terms of the similarities. And so that largely was the catalyst for another wave of investigation, but it needed more than that. It needed something tangible, something solid to actually ignite the second investigation, if you like.
But records from the crash that killed Claire Morris were of little help.
Malcolm Webster effectively carried out the perfect murder, because he was never a suspect, because there was never a crime. Had there been a connection that was a crime, he would have very quickly have been in the frame, and very quickly I'm sure the evidence would have been there to support it, because there was a lot of circumstantial evidence, and clearly the toxicology of the post-mortem would have very much been focused on sedatives. But at that time, it was only an alcohol screening that was carried out. The pathologist, Dr. James Grieve, very highly experienced, highly respected gentleman, he did have a meticulous record of what had happened in the original post-mortem.
What the investigation needed was solid evidence, something tangible.
That physical evidence came from another remarkable source, and that was a small piece of liver tissue from the original post-mortem of Claire back in 1994. And with the passage of time and the advance of science, the toxicology around that was remarkable.
They found a way of testing it for unnatural substances, and with this new method they found temazepam in that sample, and that it was a 90-something% chance that it was temazepam, and that is not something that could be naturally in there from the body generating it. It would have to be planted there.
This tiny sliver of liver led to the remarkable outcome for us as investigators that there was indeed clear evidence, scientific evidence, that there was sedative in that liver tissue, which then entirely changed the circumstances of the original road traffic collision, because all the circumstances indicated that somehow Claire must have been incapacitated at the time of the collision, because there was no other way of explaining why she didn't escape from the vehicle herself.
To strengthen their case further, police returned to the collision that had killed Claire Morris.
They said it was an accident. So you think, well, people have accidents, you know, and that was my visualisation of it. He said that he'd swerved to avoid a motorcycle. Unless you're detached from that person and looking at it in the cold light of day, it's very difficult to be suspicious when somebody has, prior to that, gained your trust. But if I'd been a policeman or a fireman or something like that, and I had known Malcolm, then I might have been able to look at it with more constructively critical eyes.
That critical eye was to come from specialist crash scene investigators who focused on the speed of the collision.
Investigators are pretty good at estimating a speed from the damage that's presented on the vehicle. And there's lots of research papers to support that too. So it would be relatively obvious, standing at the scene of this collision, that you were dealing with a low speed impact as opposed to quite a high velocity energy exchange.
Webster had claimed to have swerved to avoid a motorcycle, a story which now appeared flawed.
If you're dealing with an evasive steer, a case where a driver's reacting to a hazard in the road, say an oncoming vehicle or an animal or something like that, you would expect a significant amount of steering to be applied very quickly indeed. It doesn't lose a lot of speed as it's travelling across the road, so it would be slightly unusual to end up with quite a low speed impact at the end of a swerve or an evasive manoeuvre.
Crash investigators now turned their attention to the fire that engulfed Claire's car.
In this case, there were witnesses that described the fire took hold of the vehicle 15 or 20 minutes after the original collision. Whilst fires take a while to propagate through a vehicle, this would be the case when the vehicle is colder than it was at the time of the collision. We also look at that in conjunction with the fact that it was a very low speed impact. We have a low speed impact and a late onset of a fire. That would be very unusual.
Satisfied that Claire's accident was deliberate, the investigation revisited the incident in New Zealand.
Webster's allegation in the second collision was that there was a defect with the steering that caused him to swerve across the road. It's highly unlikely that a defect to any part of the steering system would cause the vehicle to swerve across the road in the way that it did.
As police investigated Malcolm Webster, he was in the Scottish Highlands with a woman called Simone Banerjee, who he'd met in 2004 and who knew nothing of his past or what he had planned.
He had no care for anyone except himself. Every time he met somebody, he was planning to get their money and kill them.
The net was closing in on killer Malcolm Webster. police working to bring him to justice for the murder and attempted murder of his first 2 wives. But Webster, once again, is a man with a plan. Engaged to be married, he can't allow his past to catch up with him.
I took a phone call from Webster, who had heard that there was investigations ongoing into the death of Claire. And he was highly indignant. He was pseudo-aggressive in terms of how could you possibly think that I could be involved in anything to do with Claire's death. Very dramatic phone call. Definitely a determined phone call to try and, for whatever reason, convince somebody on the other end of a phone that he wasn't involved in his murder. And it struck me as being somewhat pathetic that somebody might think that they could, in a phone call, just douse down the interest in a murder investigation.
Argyll for Malcolm Webster and his new fiancée Simone Banerjee. Life seemed good. She did not know about his past, or that he had a wife and child in New Zealand. Furthermore, she didn't know of his history of faking illnesses.
We know that he, on several occasions, groomed women through sympathy in relation to apparent terminal illnesses such as leukemia.
Munchausen syndrome, where people pretend or feign illness, even poison themselves in order to get medical attention, is not unknown. We know that Webster would have been very aware that illness brings with it attention. After all, he had been a nurse.
Planning a honeymoon aboard their yacht, nurse Simone Banerjee could not have imagined her fiancé's cancer was bogus.
And in fact, he went to the extent of apparently going for chemotherapy, and in absence from the family home, he was actually engaging with other women, but he would return home with his head shaven, his eyebrows shaven, apparently as part of his chemotherapy. So that was the extent that he would go to. And again, that pattern of behaviour continued. And again, it was an ingredient in the relationship that he had with the latest lady in Argyll, where, as a nurse, and her friend as a nurse were convinced that he had leukemia.
Police were watching Webster and becoming increasingly concerned for his fiancée's safety.
If you take all of the circumstances of Claire's murder and the staged accident and the death and the insurance payout, and if you take all of the circumstances and ingredients of what he did with Felicity in New Zealand, the staged accident, the insurance, the signing over of the house, the estate, all of the ingredients are there. And when you look at his relationship with the lady Simone in Argyll, again, there was a relationship building with a woman of some wealth. There wasn't the insurance wraparound at that particular point in time, but there was the bequeath, the signing over of a house that was worth £250,000. There was a yacht that was worth a substantial amount of money that he had a half share in. So again, it wouldn't be too difficult to draw some conclusions potentially of what was going to be the outcome.
Malcolm was supposed to be taking her on a boat for several weeks, and it turned out that he'd actually damaged her life jacket. This person was going to kill again.
When it became known that they were about to embark on a fairly lengthy yacht trip around the Canaries, that's when the decision was taken that something had to be done. And so there was an intervention through what we call an Osman warning, where if the police become aware of intelligence that they believe that someone's life is in danger, then you're obliged to advise and notify that individual. You don't have to reveal the source of that suspicion or intelligence or information, but there is a duty of care in terms of advising, and of course that's what was done. Simone was warned that there was a genuine belief that she was in a relationship with a dangerous individual who had a history that would suggest that she needed to think very carefully. about continuing that relationship.
Malcolm Webster fled to Surrey, where in February 2009 he was finally arrested and charged with the murder of Claire and the attempted murder of Felicity. Police had a dossier of circumstantial evidence, but could they find something tangible that would reveal the killer's mistake? At his trial, a jury heard about his pyromania.
There are so many incidents of fire that Webster was involved in. 2 houses, one in New Zealand, one in Scotland, went on fire that he was responsible for. Obviously, the tragic fire involving Claire. But beyond that, there were other incidences of fire, even up until months before he was arrested. In the hospital that he was working in Argyll, there was a fire in a dustbin, which he found and doused out and became a bit of a hero. Because undoubtedly Webster needed to be the centre of attention. So the fires were a real feature of Webster's life.
And there were those that were prepared to testify to that.
We randomly got a phone call from a police sergeant in England, Kent, Surrey, I think, who had seen the publicity, had recognised Webster and recognised him as a fellow scout when they were 14, 15 years old. And he was compelled to tell us that even in those days, young Webster had a reputation involving fires. So on scout trips, things had gone on fire and Webster was never far away. And that nickname he had, which there's a certain irony in, and the nickname was Pyro.
During the trial, Claire's brother Peter would learn of a much darker side to his brother-in-law.
I mean, one of the things that I asked Derek Ogg, the QC, at the time of the trial was that after the supposed accident, and Malcolm had been picked up by an ambulance and taken to Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, they tested his pulse and that was normal. They tested his pupil dilation and that was normal. And I said to Mr. Ogg, how can that be? Because if you've been in a genuine accident, your pulse and everything would be all up anyway because of the shock of what's happened. And if you committed a crime, surely you'd be excited as well. So how could they be normal? And his reply to me was astonishing. He said, Malcolm is a psychopath. He can put himself into a bubble when he's committing a crime, and he can completely detach himself from what he's doing whilst he's doing it. Which I didn't even know people like that existed prior to this. That is something for me which is astonishingly scary.
So what was the cause of his ultimate downfall, the killer's mistake?
He underestimated people. He was very confident of his own intelligence, his own planning. He thought that he had covered all the bases, but actually this wasn't a clever man. This was a manipulative man. But when you look back, most of the things he did were quite clumsy. Things like telling the people who turned up at the accident there was no body in the car. He didn't even think that there would be evidence in his wives' bodies of the drugs that he was giving them. He decided to repeat what he'd done. So one car crash is unusual when it kills somebody. To have two, and then to have a third person who's being drugged. So I think that his arrogance and his overconfidence in himself underpinned all of those clumsy mistakes he made that made it easier for the police, even looking back at these as historic crimes, to prove that he was a liar.
Here we have a man who cares absolutely nothing for anybody and will allow nothing to get in the way of him achieving what he wants. He is a highly calculated man. He's an intelligent man, and He is a man who has become overconfident because he has believed that he has got away with his crime. So here is a man whose life is gradually causing him to have a higher and higher inflated view of his own ability to evade justice.
An arrogant man, but crucially also a greedy one.
Of course, the overriding motive in all of Webster's actions will come back to his greed, his insatiable desire for wealth. I think he lived his life in a complete fantasy, and he was successful in many ways in terms of his goal of making money out of that, until eventually his greed tripped him up.
Webster's mistakes would cost him dear. On the 5th of July 2011, he was sentenced to life and will serve a minimum of 30 years. The judge likened his case to that of a puzzle.
I think it was well described as being like a 1,000-piece jigsaw that was strewn across the floor, and until such time as the jigsaw was put together, not just by the police but by family, by friends, there was a whole network who helped put this jigsaw together, but only then did it become clear that Webster's whole life was predicated on lies, fantasy, wealth-driven plans to take advantage of women, often vulnerable women who fell for him. He was a charmer. He was a quintessential English gentleman.
Yet he felt no remorse for his crimes.
He had no problem with discarding people's lives, and no remorse or regret for doing so.
No, he's never shown remorse. He's never admitted his guilt. He maintains his innocence to this day, but that's not unusual. That's not to be... you wouldn't necessarily be surprised at that, because he probably right now is sitting in a cell in prison, still feeling a little bit hard done by. That's the reality that is Malcolm Webster.
Sally Lawrence impressed everyone who came across her, including the man who bought the business where she worked.
When I bought him out, he said, "I've got one bit of advice for you, son. You look after Sally, and she'll look after you." And it absolutely turned out to be the case. She was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
John Bolting was to introduce Sally to an airline pilot called Ian Lawrence. The couple looked set for life. So why one day did Sally appear so frightened of him?
So in the days leading up to the event, Sally had texted close friends and her daughters, just raising some concerns around Ian's demeanour.
When she spoke to her friends, she said she could see evil in his eyes, and she was worried that one day he might kill her.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Ian Lawrence as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake?
I think it was about midnight, so going into the 7th of October, when I received a call from one of my detective inspectors.
Neil Castle was hearing news of a car crash, not something a murder squad detective would usually get involved in.
The passenger in the vehicle that had collided with a tree had died at the scene. And the driver of the vehicle, who was a male, had been taken to hospital and appeared to be unconscious and had, on the face of it, some trauma and some potential brain injuries.
I don't think people realise how sophisticated crash scene investigation is, especially these days with all the electronics in cars.
One of the collision investigators that had attended the scene had raised some concerns around whether or not it was actually an accident.
But they did some analysis on the tread marks, and the tread marks show that there had been no deceleration. So the car had gone into the tree and had not slowed down.
Later on, a nurse contacted us in the incident room saying she wasn't comfortable with a patient that she treated that evening and believed that he may have been feigning some of his injuries.
The patient was Ian Lawrence. The accident had happened on this road in Leicester. The woman in the passenger seat, who had died, was Sally Lawrence, wife to Ian. A man plunged into grief was John Bolting, who'd introduced the couple to each other.
My son told me that Sally was dead, and at that time I was sitting down because I couldn't believe it. And I said, you know what happened? And he said, well, all I can say, Dad, is that they've arrested her husband on suspicion of murder.
What was the truth behind death on a road? Who were the couple at the centre of a tragedy?
Ian Lawrence was seemingly a very successful man. He had been an airline pilot. He was a successful businessman. His marriage seemed to be very successful, and to all intents and purposes, it looked as if he had the perfect life.
Sally had worked her way up from being PA to the managing director at the chemical spills company, and she was doing particularly well.
Incredible enthusiasm for life, always smiling, you know, and always looked on the bright side of everything. It didn't matter what it was, she was always on the plus side, you know. Nothing was ever half empty with Sally, you know, and yeah, I thought the world of her.
He thought the world of Ian too.
Ian Lawrence was a pilot, and so was I, and I was a member of the Leicestershire Aero Club, and I actually introduced them to each other. And she was basically looking for a partner, and I said, well, you know, I know somebody who I thought at the time would be ideal.
When Sally was introduced to it, and they got on really well immediately, and quite soon were married in a very lavish, extravagant wedding.
Well, they got married in St James the Greater Church in Leicester. There were somewhere around about between 200 and 250 people. It's a big church with a lot of people in there. So they let off 15,000 quid for the fireworks. I mean, the display went on for about 40 minutes, something like that. It was quite extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it.
That was in the year 2000, and at first all seemed well. Then a setback made matters between them less than harmonious.
In 2007, that seems to be the beginning where things started to go wrong for Ian Lawrence, and he was sacked from his job as an airline pilot, and that seemed to set in motion a kind of a downward spiral.
She used to have confined an awful lot in me, and it was apparent to me that things were going really, really wrong.
I think when he lost his job as an airline pilot, that really did dent his ego and maybe started to show the cracks that were in his marriage behind the scenes. And it did seem that Sally and he started to have problems, and that's not surprising either, because he wouldn't have responded well to being challenged.
Prior to being a pilot, Ian Lawrence had actually suffered setbacks in failed businesses. Losing his latest high-status job seemed to alter his personality. His attitude towards Sally could occasionally get ugly.
Yeah, we were in a local pub. We'd gone to have a business lunch, and she was telling me that she was really frightened of him, and that, you know, she was frightened of what he would do.
Quite often in some relationships that look almost perfect from the outside. Things are very, very different behind the scenes. And where you have this almost, sometimes you might think it's like a managed vision of what the family is, that usually means that there's somebody in the background who's very controlling. And I think probably that Ian Lawrence was a very controlling individual.
I said at the time to Sally, I said, don't worry, all bullies are cowards. I said, the chances are he won't do anything.
But as time went by, he did enough to convince Sally there was no future in the marriage.
They were living together still. They were living separately. So the marriage was falling apart right in front of his eyes.
She told me things that were not right. I knew that they were not, sharing a room together. I knew that she was spending a lot of time away with her family in Derbyshire.
In 2012, Sally actually filed for divorce, and it was that divorce that seems to have unsettled things at that point.
She was looking to move on and just start a new life away from Ian.
She was happy for the first time in her life, but to somebody like Ian Lawrence, he wasn't going to accept this. He didn't move out of the house, so they had to live together, even though the house was actually in her name, and it was going to be divided up. He actually wanted a greater proportion of that money and sent her a text to that effect. And she was actually quite scared of him.
She wanted a new relationship, and that would have been incendiary for somebody like Ian Lawrence. At least at this point, there was the facade that they were still together, that he was still in control, and in a lot of ways he did still have a lot of control over her because they were still living together. But she was going to leave, and that would have escalated things dramatically.
Sally ploughed on with her plans to leave Ian.
Divorce proceedings were ongoing. We found out that the decree nisi was due to be served on Monday the 8th of October.
But Ian, in the background, was refusing, absolutely refusing to let go. His whole identity was tied up in this family, his whole status in the world, and there was no way in his head that he was going to let her, as he saw it, do this to him.
October the 8th, 2012 was the date which would bring an end to a marriage which had simply become untenable for one of the parties. The couple shared a home, but not a life. Sally was seeing another man as she waited for the divorce to go through, but as she planned the next chapter of her life, Ian Lawrence was planning how best to get the most out of the failing relationship, which in his case meant the proceeds from the sale of the shared house.
The house was at the time valued at probably £300,000. There was a lot of equity in it. That was all in Sally's name.
And he had nothing, and they'd agreed terms, and then a couple of days before, one day before, he changed the terms and said he wanted half of the house. And she said no, he wasn't getting it.
Sally had texted close friends and her daughters, just raising some concerns around Ian's demeanour. He was demanding more money out of the house.
Emotions run high when a divorce is going through, but almost all eventually end in a settlement. Ian Lawrence had been accused by Sally of bullying her. Throughout their rocky times, he had urged her to think again, to try to make the marriage work. But Sally had moved on. She refused to change her mind over the divorce, and now Ian was demanding last-minute changes in his favour. Theirs was a story which was on a dangerous road.
Ian very carefully came up with a plan that if he couldn't have his wife, if he couldn't make her fall in love with him again, then he would get rid of her, basically.
As the minutes ticked away before the decree nisi and the divorce of Ian and Sally Lawrence, a plan was forming in Ian's mind.
The finalising of the divorce would have changed Ian Lawrence's financial status within the marriage, for one thing, and I think he felt he was running out of time and he needed to put his plan into action.
Criminologist Jane Monckton-Smith has specialised in studying cases of domestic abuse.
It's a surprising fact, but it is a fact that very often, more often than not, in these cases, where somebody absolutely refuses to let go and their behaviour starts to escalate, that they may make the decision that they're going to kill the person who they see as causing all the angst in their life. Because when she spoke to her friends, she said she could see evil in his eyes.
She was saying in some of her text messages that she felt threatened, she didn't want to be alone in the house with him. One of them said she'd locked herself in her bedroom.
She feared that he would actually kill her one day.
This is one of the really big red flags that we see when this kind of thing happens, that the victim actually foretells what could possibly happen to them.
Sally's fears were true. The airline pilot felt he had plenty of reasons to kill his wife.
Sally also had a life insurance, and that would have given Ian $250,000 in life insurance. So when we're looking at potential motives for murder, there aren't that many, but two of the main ones are jealousy and greed, and they're both motives that Ian would have had. If he'd have found out about the relationship, he wouldn't have wanted Sally to be with anybody else, and then the financial side that he would gain through Sally dying before the decree nisi, then that was substantial to him as well.
Ian Lawrence made the decision that he was going to kill Sally, and he started to plan for that. And it seems that what he decided he was going to do was make her death look like an accident so that he could protect himself.
He devised a plan to actually crash the car into the tree on the road near where they lived.
And Sally was planning to go away for the weekend on that Saturday evening. She had her overnight bag packed. She had her handbag with a purse and a phone, all ready to go on the back seat of her car. And that would have been around between 5 and 6 p.m. on that Saturday evening.
If Ian's plan was going to work, he needed to get her into his car.
So at the time, Ian Lawrence had a maroon red Peugeot 406 Estate. I think at the time it would have been about 10 years old. Had a private number plate on it, which spelt Windy, which alluded to his flying days. I think some of his friends called him that as his nickname. It was a big solid estate car.
But she didn't get into her car and drive away, and some of her friends thought that that was very unusual. She actually got into his car. So he must have somehow, and we don't know how, got her to get into his car.
Sally's car was very clean and tidy, pristine inside, very well kept. Ian's car was more like a workshop. It was full of junk, full of rubbish. Sally was always well dressed, and her daughters would say that she would have never got in that car voluntarily.
I don't know how he ever got her into that car. It's an old banger, and I just bought her a new Jaguar. So I don't know what happened there. I never will know, I don't suppose.
He may have frightened her into getting the car. He may have told some plausible story, but she did get into the car, and that was the last time anyone saw her alive.
Whether she was coerced, whether she was forced, we do not know. Only Ian Lawrence knows the answer to that question. But what we do know is that she left her home address in the passenger seat of that Peugeot and was then driven along towards the racecourse and then along Stoughton Road towards the airport.
He had a go-kart track just up the road we used to go from home to every day. So that's the route that he took with Sally in the car.
So as he drove towards where he knew he was going to crash the car, he suddenly leaned over and he unclicked Sally's seatbelt, and he then put himself into the brace position and drove straight into a tree at 50 miles an hour.
This was a high-impact collision with a motor vehicle and a very large tree. The car had impacted almost square on, but mainly on the passenger side, and the whole of the front of the car had crumpled up. So it was a significant impact.
In a collision of a magnitude of 50 miles an hour, there's a huge amount of energy that's dispersed in a collision. If you remove all of the restraint systems in a vehicle that are designed to protect you, the likelihood of injury goes up incredibly. And therefore, your likelihood of suffering fatal injuries without the supplementary restraint systems are increased greatly.
I think it's probable that Ian Lawrence had practiced this drive, this plan that he had to kill her, because he drove to quite an isolated area. He knew where he was going to crash. This wasn't chance or random.
If you're not wearing a seatbelt, when the vehicle stops moving, your inertia causes you to travel forwards. In the case where a seatbelt isn't being worn and there's a sudden deceleration of the vehicle, the occupant moves forward, and you can often see them striking the windscreen, and you end up with damage to the inside of the windscreen, pushing it outwards.
Precisely how Sally Lawrence was found by a passerby. It appeared clear one of the people in the car would not be taken out alive.
The passenger in the vehicle that had collided with a tree had died at the scene.
It's a high-risk strategy. Driving a car into a tree with the hope that it's going to go so perfectly well that you're going to survive and the other person isn't. I'm thinking that perhaps he may have had some skills in that from being an airline pilot. He'd have thought about those kinds of things in that job. But it still shows a very reckless nature. He was willing for it to go wrong. He felt so strongly he was probably willing to die if that's what happened. But the important thing was that she did.
The risk seemed to have paid off for Ian Lawrence. He had survived the crash. The decree nisi would now not go ahead on the following Monday. He stood to own the family home outright and to benefit from a £250,000 insurance payout. Had a killer got away with murder? Or had Ian Lawrence made a mistake? The driver of a Peugeot 406, Ian Lawrence, had seemingly driven at speed into a tree. His wife in the passenger seat was dead. He was also injured, but it appeared not seriously so.
The fire brigade had attended and had to cut the occupants out of the vehicle because the doors wouldn't open. That was the severity of the impact. The condition that I was being told of the driver was that he was in and out of consciousness, was displaying signs of trauma, but nothing visibly physically. So he had no cuts, no apparent broken bones.
In this case, there was a huge disparity in the injuries suffered by both of the occupants in the vehicle. The driver suffering relatively low-level injuries for an impact of this type, and the front seat passenger sustaining fatal injuries.
Despite there being no apparent head injury, Ian Lawrence was presenting confusing behavioural evidence.
He was displaying symptoms equivalent to a 7 on the Glasgow Coma Scale. So the Glasgow Coma Scale is used to ascertain somebody's consciousness and alertness when they've been involved in some kind of trauma, usually head trauma. And they rate from 15 being fully conscious, fully mobile, down to 3, which means you'd be lying there in a coma and probably going to die. So to be scored as a 7 by medical experts at that time would put Mr. Lawrence with some severe head injuries that on the face of it weren't apparent. There didn't appear to be any bruising, any swelling or any lacerations that would cause him to have a Glasgow coma scale of 7.
The police and the paramedics arrived at the scene, and I think there were suspicions straight away, especially with the paramedics, because Ian Lawrence was pretending that he was unconscious, but he wasn't acting that out awfully well, and the paramedics would be very used to seeing people who really are unconscious, and they told of their suspicions to the police.
Upon extracting Mr. Lawrence from the car, there were some comments around whether or not he was feigning some of his injuries and feigning unconsciousness.
But he had been in an accident, so Ian was taken to hospital. Meanwhile, the news of Sally's death was broken to her family and friends.
Yeah, I found out the next day. The next morning. It was absolutely horrendous. I was with my best friend, Blue, and I just went into shock, I think.
Back at the hospital, medical teams are also becoming sceptical about the story they were hearing from Ian Lawrence.
Later on, a nurse contacted us in the incident room saying she wasn't comfortable with a patient that she treated that evening and believed that he may have been feigning some of his injuries.
So when the police started their investigation into the crash scene, they were able to find out a lot of information, and I don't think people realise quite how sophisticated these crash scene analysis are, especially with the computerisation of cars and the knowledge we have about things like tyre marks.
From looking at the scene, they weren't satisfied that this was a pure accident. They noticed that the roads were dry. The bend on which the accident happened was not a severe bend. In fact, it would have been drivable to upwards of 70 miles an hour in a roadworthy vehicle, and that would be to remain on your same side of the carriageway.
Crash scene investigator Mark Crouch is the kind of expert who would be brought in to help police understand, in forensic detail, what had gone on the night of October the 6th.
When a vehicle tyre or a vehicle wheel is being braked, it's slowing on the road surface. When it slows enough, it will lock, or if there's ABS, it will lock and unlock very, very quickly. Those kind of marks can be seen on a road surface, but there weren't any found on this occasion. When a vehicle leaves the road and enters a muddy road surface, you would expect that point to lock out those wheels. Happens much, much earlier. So for a lower level of braking, you would expect those wheels to lock out. Particularly on mud, grass, verge, you can get quite a distinctive mark where the tyre drags the grass, drags the mud along, and you would expect that to happen even with quite a low level of braking. What was found on the verge in this case was a rolling tyre mark. That wheel didn't lock out.
So the car had gone into the tree and had not slowed down on that journey. And they were also able to show that there were lots of other places that the car could have come to a stop.
There were escape routes either side of the tree that the car had collided with. There was a farm gate entrance that would have offered little resistance if you'd have wanted to drive through that. If your brakes had failed, you'd have gone into a field and gradually just coasted to a stop. So then we looked at the actual tyre tracks and the road that led to the point of impact, and there was no apparent skid marks on the tarmac.
The forensic people, they did a fantastic job. Peugeot team came over from France. They went through the car with a fine-tooth comb, and certain bits of the forensics actually that came out were rather interesting. For instance, I didn't realise that you drive into something and hit it, the first thing that's going to happen is the lights in the brake balls are going to instantly shatter because they're glowing hot. But they weren't shattered, they were intact, so he never applied any brakes.
And there were other anomalies.
The seatbelt of the driver, the seatbelt clasp, the retainer, was protruding upwards, and that is a sign that that has been in an impact, because there's an explosive device that then pulls down on the tension and then it pulls it up, and then that's how the seatbelt mechanism works. And there was abrasions on the seatbelt itself, consistent with it being in place at point of impact. The passenger side, the clasp, retaining clasp, was sitting down in the normal position, indicating that the seatbelt had not been engaged on the passenger at the time of impact.
Why was Sally not protected by a seatbelt?
Apparently she was fanatical about wearing a seatbelt. You know, she probably made sure her children wore seatbelts. Safety would have been at the top of her mind.
Family members were adamant that she was very, very safety conscious. She would never get in a car without putting on her seatbelt. It was second nature to her, and nobody had ever seen her in a vehicle without her seatbelt on.
In the hospital that weekend, Ian Lawrence had regained consciousness sufficiently well to face questions from police.
It was about 4 o'clock in the morning when I had a conversation with the collision investigator, and as a result of everything that he'd relayed to me, I then made a decision that Mr. Lawrence would be arrested on suspicion of murder while he was in hospital. It was quite clear at that time that his injuries weren't as severe as first portrayed to me, and he could really at any time discharge himself and walked out of hospital. So to prevent that, and in line with what I knew, he was arrested on suspicion of murder.
Ian Lawrence's story after the accident, and it had all gone perfectly well for him, was a kind of a low-risk strategy, really, because he pretended that he couldn't remember anything. And if you can't remember anything, you can't be picked up on lies.
He said he got no memory of it, he was unconscious, but the first two people to arrive on the scene, one was a retired police officer and the other one was a retired fireman, and they knew straight away that something was wrong. He was feigning being unconscious, and they knew that something was completely wrong.
In his first interviews, Mr. Lawrence claimed that he had a total loss of memory. He didn't remember anything after 5 o'clock on the Saturday, and he regained his memory. He remembers being in hospital at about 9 o'clock that night. So there's a 4-hour gap there where he couldn't remember what had happened.
He underestimates all of the other people around him, and that's probably because he's got a very high opinion of himself, and it doesn't occur to him that anybody would see anything other than an accident because he said so.
But detectives were not about to accept that he'd lost his memory, or that he'd done nothing wrong.
He was then released from hospital later that morning and then taken to a nearby police station, where again he was assessed for suitability for detention, booked into the police station, and then he underwent a series of interviews.
What evidence, if any, would prove telling in the gathering case against Ian Lawrence for the murder of his wife? At a crash scene in a hospital and at a police station, the events of Saturday, October 6th, which had led to the death of Sally Lawrence, were being meticulously investigated. A killer's mistake was about to be uncovered by crash investigators who were observing a series of curious problems, specifically about those things that stop us getting hurt in a car accident.
We found out that within the vehicle there was an electronic control unit that controlled the deployment of the airbags.
Vehicles are fitted with supplementary restraint systems, SRS for short. They control everything, the airbags, the seat belts are some of the most common. But in order to control those, it needs to decrypt some of the signals that are going around the car. For example, the vehicle speed, who's sitting in what seats, and detecting a crash. Those signals are constantly going around the vehicle. Those messages are constantly being sent round. But the vehicle needs to make a decision when it's going to deploy an airbag. That's an electronic control module, often shortened to an ACM, an airbag control module. That is constantly listening to these signals going around the vehicle. It decides when the crash is happening and decides when the parameters are met to deploy the airbag. Lots of those ACMs control and record the events of a crash. So you end up with window snapshots of the information that that black box had at the time that the crash occurred.
And the snapshot was showing a glaring anomaly. Why had Sally's airbag not deployed when the Peugeot 406 hit the tree at 50 miles an hour?
And we took that to Peugeot, and a technician there was able to read the data from that. And from the data held within that box, we ascertained that the passenger airbag had been switched off, and had been switched off some 6 cycles prior to the crash. That was groundbreaking for us. We could actually prove that somebody had turned that airbag off intentionally, and that's why it didn't deploy.
Turning passenger airbags off is quite an easy thing to do. It's a function that's built into many vehicles, because if you wanted to fit a child seat to the front of the car, for example, it's unsafe to have an airbag that would go off in those scenarios. Most of them activated on a key, so you can just turn it off on the side of the vehicle to stop the airbag activating in a crash of that type.
In order to disable the airbag, it takes a physical act. You have to have the key to the vehicle, insert it into a socket, press down into the spring and turn it physically. So it couldn't have been done accidentally. It was an intentional act to turn that airbag off.
The crash itself was telling the real story of what had happened to Sally Lawrence.
In this collision, we have a number of different factors striking the tree on the passenger side. The seatbelt not being worn, the airbag being deactivated, the lack of clear braking marks as the vehicle left the verge, and the impact speed being similar to the account of the speed of travel of the vehicle down the road. Individually, those pieces aren't that significant. They're not that uncommon to occur 1, 2 of those in a collision. But when you start looking at all of those together, it starts to build quite a compelling picture that something unconventional happened in this collision.
Police interview specialists were steadfastly interrogating someone who was no longer considered a grieving husband, but a suspect in a murder case.
So Ian maintained throughout his police interview his amnesia and therefore his innocence. He denied that there was anything wrong with the relationship. He denied that he'd intentionally crashed his car. He denied that he'd unclipped Sally's seatbelt prior to the point of impact.
Why would he? His was a good relationship with Sally.
According to him, they lived together. They've been living together for over 10 years. They had a normal family life, and he didn't allude to any problems with the relationship at all. So as part of our ongoing investigation throughout that next day, we're in contact with Sally's family members through her sister, her daughters, and it becomes apparent that the relationship had broken down between Ian and Sally. They'd been living separate lives for over a year, although living in the same house. The relationship was stressful, and we then later found out that, in fact, Sally had commenced another relationship with another man and had been in that relationship for about 10 months.
It was after first releasing Ian Lawrence, as inquiries continued, that the news reached detectives that the car's airbag had been tampered with. Together with knowing of the failing relationship, the approaching divorce, the fact that Ian Lawrence had not applied his brake as he drove at 50 miles an hour into a tree, and that Sally was inexplicably wearing no seatbelt, was enough for Neil Castle to make his move.
So that, on the face of it, was fresh evidence for us. It was something that we weren't aware of before while Ian Lawrence had been in custody. I then made a policy decision that was fresh evidence, sent officers out to further arrest Lawrence. He was brought back into custody, a short interview, and then we presented those facts to the CPS, and they gave us authorised to charge murder.
There was more. A search of Sally's car revealed evidence against Ian.
Sally was planning to go away for the weekend on that Saturday evening. She had her overnight bag packed. She had a handbag with a purse and a phone, all ready to go on the back seat of her car. And that would have been around between 5 and 6 p.m. on that Saturday evening.
They found on the back of her Jaguar was a handbag and an overnight bag that she was taking. She was going to stay away that night. Clearly, she would not have got in that car. She would not have got in that car with Ian Lawrence anyway, but clearly she would not have left her handbag there and keys and money to get into his car, this filthy car that she'd never get into unless she'd been forced.
At trial, Ian Lawrence pleaded not guilty. The jury did not believe him. By a majority verdict of 10-1, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life.
No, I had no misgivings whatsoever. I knew what the verdict was going to be. Everybody cheered at the time, I didn't.
Lawrence tried one more tack on appeal. He remembered something that he had failed to reveal at his original trial.
He said he had a dream while he was in prison,
saying that he had a medical condition and he could prove that his leg spasmed.
Ian Lawrence eventually came up with a version of events that while he was driving along that road, he had a seizure in his leg, which then pressed down on the accelerator, increased speed of the vehicle. He was unable to move his leg and engage the brake, but he did manage to get his foot off the accelerator, but the vehicle glided and continued towards the tree. He didn't give any explanation as to why the passenger side took the full force of the impact.
I mean, it was just so pathetic, you know.
There was nothing wrong with the steering wheel, even if what Ian Lawrence had said about having a leg spasm were true. He could still have steered the car away from the tree. But what they found in the appeal was that his leg spasm would not have caused the accident as it happened.
He got life with a minimum of 24 years. The judge put 3 years extra on for it being for money. He put another 3 years on for him using the car as a weapon to kill her. And then he put another 3 years on because it was premeditated.
I think he'd gone to a lot of planning around this. He'd picked the location. It was a location that he was aware of. He'd have driven down that road probably between 2 and 4 times a day. It was towards his place of work where the go-kart track was. He'd have driven along that road. He'd have seen that tree on numerous occasions.
The motive for this murder seems clear.
I know why he did it. He did it for money. He was a failed businessman. He got 3 small companies, all of which were struggling, and he had nothing. They'd agreed terms, and then a couple of days before, he changed the terms and said he wanted half of the house. And she said no, and yeah, that's why he killed her, purely for financial gain.
The amount of cold calculated planning that went into that accident shows what a callous, cruel man Ian Lawrence was. He took away his wife's life in that way, just so that he could have that house.
Sally Lawrence had children from a former marriage as well as that with Ian. Her family continued to support the needs of her children.
Everything we do as police officers is for the families of the victims. And it's a great feeling when you can look the family in the eye and you know that you and your team have done everything you can to secure and preserve the evidence, to then put a case together, present it at court and convince a jury that that person was guilty of that offence. And that's what we did.
He had made many mistakes, but central to the case against Ian Lawrence was the evidence which proved he had tampered with the seatbelt and airbag to ensure maximum injuries would be caused when driving into a tree at 50 miles an hour. Ian Lawrence will not be due for parole until the year 2027. One man is dead and another is missing. They have something in common. Both had slept with Kelly Cochran.
Outside of work, he didn't go anywhere with her. They had just, I guess, a sex-arranged relationship.
Detectives were about to delve into a bizarre world of easy sex and a pact to kill being played out in the wilderness by a Great Lake.
He begged her nonstop to stay home, be his wife, stop having affairs, and she just continued to belittle him.
If one of them, Jason or Kelly, ever had an affair and the other person found out, the plan would be both spouses would kill the person the spouse was having an affair with.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the puzzle will reveal Kelly Cochran as guilty of murder? What would be the killer's mistake? In 2016, an Indiana cop decides to make up a story, one which might reveal the truth about a woman called Kelly Cochran and her late husband, Jason.
I had jotted down on my notes this idea of creating a fictitious letter that Jason Cochran had made up prior to his death in the event of his death. So I was like throwing this idea around on paper, and I was also throwing around the idea of Walt Ammerman presenting this idea on my behalf as a confidential informant.
He said, I have an idea, and I want you to call her on a recorded call, and I'd like you to tell her that Jason mailed you a letter a while back and wanted you to hold on to it in case something ever happened to him.
And honestly, my first thought was, this is never gonna work. You know, she is too smart. She knows everyone's looking at her closely right now, especially with her husband dying. There is no way she's gonna fall for this, but I was willing to try anything.
Agreement reached between detectives and a willing citizen. A murder suspect gets a call.
I just said I had this letter that Jason mailed me and told me to hold on to another letter, and said if anything ever happened to him, I needed to send this on to the police in the Upper Peninsula.
The sting had been set up to get to the truth about what two people, Jason and Kelly Cochran, had got up to shortly after moving from Indiana to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan.
They were just looking for new opportunities, is my understanding. It's a beautiful area. I'm not familiar with the part of Indiana that they're from. I've been told it's not the greatest area in the world. And I think they were just looking to get a fresh start and came to an area that they thought they could get a fresh start at.
For 2 years, a man called Chris Reagan had been missing and was thought to be somewhere out in the Upper Peninsula. He had simply disappeared. Dead or alive, he was proving hard to find.
Working in those really austere environments, sometimes we have to bike or ski or hike for a day or two or three before we can even get into the area where we're investigating or looking for a missing person, or you have to fly in or take a helicopter, and those are extremely difficult cases to work, very expensive.
The Upper Peninsula of Michigan is very, I don't want to say desolate, but in a sense it is compared to where most people live. There's a lot of open land, not a lot of industry up there anymore. So you could drive for miles and miles and not see any kind of business or come into any towns.
There are plenty of places to bury a body out here, or to find yourself in trouble with no one near to help. Terry O'Donnell went looking for her former boyfriend Chris Regan when he went missing.
I searched those woods, thinking maybe he parked there, he had problems with the car, and something happened to him in the woods.
On October 27th of 2014, I met Terry O'Donnell, who came to the police department as I was leaving for the day. She was shook up, she was crying. That's when she told me that something was wrong, her friend was missing. She came into the office and explained to me what she had found. She hadn't heard from him since October 14th. And then one of his coworkers spotted his vehicle parked in a park and ride just east of Iron River. You know, there were other details. She went to his apartment, things didn't look right there. So, you know, she had concern that something bad had happened to him.
Terry and Chris were just friends, but had been really close. Childhood sweethearts, their lives had gone in different directions. Marriages, children, and divorces later, they got back together.
And so we met up and wined and dined and just had a wonderful time and just started dating again. Yeah, it was awesome. It was wonderful. When Chris would look at me, I just melt. I mean, he just had that he was charismatic, and he just made you feel like you were everything. You know, that you were the only person in the room when he looked at you.
Apparently Chris, you know, made a trip to Iron River to visit Terry, fell in love with the area, wanted to change. You know, Chris being an avid outdoorsman, he loved it up there. So he interviewed for a job while he was in town visiting her. He got the position and immediately moved up there with her.
And I kept telling him, we're not living here. Don't look for a job here. Look for a job in Marquette or Appleton, somewhere bigger. And he didn't. He found work here in Iron River. He was not supposed to be here. We were not supposed to be in Iron River. And we ended up here.
He and Terry, their relationship turned more into just a friendship. They didn't really have the same ideas about their futures, but they remained very good friends.
Chief Frizzo is being diplomatic. Terry had ended their relationship after Chris had made a revelation about his sex life.
Christopher had an issue with pornography that I found out when him and I started talking more about why he needed a little bit more alone time. And he was hooked on things on the internet. And I didn't agree with that. And that's why we broke up. I still loved him. And maybe that's why, you know, we stayed friends. I kept in touch with him. He would still call or text. But we couldn't date. We couldn't be a couple because it just wasn't right. At least for me, that wasn't right.
Chris was working at a place called Lake Shore, where he had kept a lot more secret than an addiction to pornography.
You know, Chris, he didn't really have a lot of friends there, just a couple people that he really, you know, would associate with. And there was a woman that he was allegedly having an affair with.
And so people told me that, you know, there were rumors at Lakeshore that he was hooking up with Kelly Cochran. I was just astonished, to be honest, that Christopher had like this second life.
A second life with a woman who, together with her husband Jason, had a colourful attitude to relationships altogether. Her name, Kelly Cochran.
Kelly talked about the affair she was having with Chris and how Jason was aware of it and he was okay with it, that they had an open marriage. But Jason, on the other hand, it bothered him, but he was afraid of losing his wife, so he tried to allow her to basically live her life and not interfere with it. But it was clearly driving him crazy.
I would say that their marriage was controlled by Kelly. Their lives together were controlled by her. She did all the cooking, the financing, everything, the grocery shopping. He didn't really do much of anything. He just did what he could to keep her happy.
You know, she was very emotionally abusive to him. He begged her nonstop to stay home, be his wife, stop having affairs, and she just continued to belittle him.
Obviously, she wasn't happy in her marriage as she was engaging in extramarital affairs. I did talk to her family members and got what information they had about Jason. And of course, I gleaned what information I could about Jason and his relationship with Kelly from some of his own words and some of the statements that he made in his while being evaluated for some mental health issues, and in the writings that he had, which were, quite frankly, very disturbing and kind of made you wonder what kind of person this really was.
I was having dinner with Jason and Kelly at a restaurant there in their town, and oddly, she asked him, "Did you show Walt our friend?" I had no idea what she was talking about, and he showed me a picture of a half-naked woman on his phone, and Kelly said, "Yeah, I found a friend for Jason and I because I love him so much that I wanted to keep him happy." And that threw me for a loop.
And then Walt learns of the wedding day vow tacked on to the standard marriage ceremony by Jason and Kelly.
Kelly's story is they agreed on their wedding night that if either of them ever cheated, they got to kill that person.
The story of the marriage pact came from Kelly's words herself. Was it true? Was it not true? I think only Kelly and Jason will know. It allegedly was said on their wedding night, and I don't think anyone was really privy to what was going on there besides the two of them.
If it was true, had Chris Reagan picked the wrong woman with whom to have an affair?
I think Kelly's very smart, and she's very manipulative, and I think everything that she said and did was because she was, covering her tracks.
The helicopter view of the life and times of 4 people living their lives in the Iron River area of the Upper Peninsula, Michigan, was set up for trouble by the autumn of 2014. Terry O'Donnell had found everything too bizarre to stay involved with the porn-addicted Chris Reagan. Chris had admitted to an affair with the allegedly abusive Kelly Cochran, and Jason Cochran could rely on a wedding day vow to kill anyone who fooled around with his wife. On October the 14th, Chris got a call from Kelly.
Kelly Cochran lured Christopher Reagan to her house. She lured him with the promise of a great dinner, lasagna, and perhaps a little something on the side. With that, Christopher Reagan, he set off. He had to draw a map to remind himself how to get to Kelly's house. In the meantime, on his way over there, he'd been talking to his ex-girlfriend. They were still very good friends. She was excited for him because the very next day, Chris was going to start his new life, a new job in the Carolinas.
For his new job, he had to have a physical, and actually, that's the last day I spoke to him. It was October 14th, 2014. That morning, it was about 6 a.m. in the morning, he called me and told me that he was going to be going to Marshfield the next day. That was the last time I talked to him. That was the last time I heard from him, was that morning.
Terry called round to help Chris pack, as arranged. He was not at his apartment.
I kept texting, messaging him, and I got no response. And normally he would respond immediately, or when he would have a break if he was at work.
I mean, she knew that he was going somewhere that night, but where is he? Why wouldn't he show up for his job, and why wouldn't he say a last goodbye to her?
And a week went by and I still hadn't heard from him, and I was talking to people at work, and I was, what should I do? I can't get a hold of him. And I went up to the apartment, knocked on the door, there was no one there. And everyone told me that I was being paranoid and that I should just, relax, we weren't dating, and maybe he, found someone else.
On October 27th of 2014, I met Terry O'Donnell, who came to the police department as I was leaving for the day. She was shook up, she was crying. That's when she told me that something was wrong, her friend was missing. came into the office and explained to me what she had found. She hadn't heard from him since October 14th.
Terry had found Chris's car, and inside it was a post-it note with a map on it.
And there was a sticky note on the passenger seat, and it had directions written on it. I said, this is the last place he was. This is wherever these directions go to on this note, that's the last place he ever was.
You know, and I just remember her saying, I can't make heads or tails of these directions.
They were directions to Kelly Cochran's home in Old Caspian. That was the last place he was.
So immediately, I've got some red flags.
Iron County cops were dispatched to the address that a discarded note in his car had suggested, the home of Kelly and Jason Cochran.
She said when they went to the door, they asked for Kelly. They were met by Jason Cochran, who seemed irritated and told them that Kelly was not there. The trooper had noticed a silhouette in the upper window upstairs of the residence and actually made mention of that to the sergeant, saying there's somebody upstairs. And as they're talking to Jason, Kelly presents herself. So they talk to her outside. She admits that she was having an affair with Chris. She admits that she knew he was supposed to have shown up for a medical appointment for his new job, but she claims that she hadn't seen him since, around the 12th, 13th of October.
And when they ask Kelly about her relationship with Christopher, she refers to him in the past tense. They haven't said anything that he's murdered or that he's missing. She's already referring to him in the past tense.
The first thing I did when I found out about Kelly Cochran and Christopher having this affair with her, I Googled her and her husband so I could see what they look like. And I'm glad I did, because I was afraid. I didn't know what happened to Chris, and in my mind he was killed, and they were the last people to see him, and in my mind they did it, and I didn't have any doubt.
What she tells them, again, goes in direct contradiction from what they already know. She claims she hasn't seen him in a couple of weeks, and the police know it's only been a couple of days. So she's speaking in past tense, couple of weeks, and it's only been a couple of days.
Having suspicions is one thing, proving something is another.
They went around town like nothing happened. The detectives interviewed Kelly and Jason, and they acted like nothing happened. Kelly said, "Oh, I stopped by and he wasn't home. I didn't know where he was."
There was no evidence of any foul play related to Chris Regan's sudden disappearance. As days turned into weeks, Chief of Iron River Police Frizzo knew she needed help in searching for Chris. There was no shortage of volunteers.
I get a phone call from Mike Niger. Mike Niger calls and says, I'm retired from the state police. He gives me his whole background, tells me how he wants to help me at no cost to me, which was huge because, we don't have a lot of finances in our department, and I'll take all the help I can get.
So did a lot of searching for her right away. I came over and just rechecked the area around the park and ride where the car was found, looking for evidence and, Chris anywhere in that area.
I kept looking and searching for Christopher. I would walk in the woods. I would walk back behind Cochran's home, trying to find something. And they had a big dog. I'd hear a dog bark. It'd scare me. I was afraid if Kelly ever found out that I was the one who missed Christopher, that I was the one that reported him missing. I was afraid her husband might come looking for me.
Of course, at this stage, it was still possible that Chris had had an accident.
Iron County is a very rugged area. It's a historic area with a lot of old mining. So we have a lot of old mines and mining relics. And we have a lot of caving grounds where old mine shafts and stuff have caved in, and then they filled in with water.
Well, I first heard about this case would have been around the time that Mr. Regan disappeared in the fall of 2014. It was big news in the area. In fact, we'd had a couple other people that had just kind of vanished for various other reasons. And that's something that the local media had picked up on, and something that I kept an eye on, wondering what had happened to this individual. You know, a lot of things happen in the woods around here. People go hiking and sometimes trip or fall or have heart attacks in the woods, so you really don't know what happened.
Many thought that Chris could have had an accident or simply left without telling anyone, something Laura Frizzo considered.
He doesn't want to be found.
Terry wasn't buying that.
Christopher had went to Kelly Cochran's house October 14th that night, and I wonder why he went there. Kelly has said several things, you know, like he went there for sex or she had drugs for him. And I think, why this time would he go to her apartment or her house? He had never been there before. So why now? He knew Jason. He knew Kelly's husband was in Iron River. Kelly always went to his place. Why would Christopher go to that house?
6 months after he had disappeared, last presumed to be at Kelly's house, Iron Mountain police get permission to search the Cochran household.
When that search warrant is done for the day, it's like 10 o'clock at night, and we leave there, and the following morning, Kelly and Jason Cochran take off. They completely leave, taking just what they could fit in their truck, and would never return to Michigan.
They vanished. They left in the middle of the night and went back to Indiana, where they had originally come from. And so as quick as they showed up, they left again.
And what evidence had turned up from the forensic search of their home?
They collected a lot of evidence, and we got nothing from that evidence, nothing to establish Chris Regan was in that residence. And I remember that moment because I was so sure. You know, I had these big binders, these big books of my case sitting on the back table, and I got off the phone and I just wanted to take them and toss them out the window because I was so frustrated.
So Jason and Kelly were on the road, and the mystery of Chris Regan's whereabouts remained. Was his body somewhere out in the woods? By April 2016, the Cochrans, now living with Jason's parents in Hobart, Indiana, were back in touch with their online gaming friend, Walt Ackerman. He was wondering why they'd disappeared from the scene.
I didn't hear from him for close to a month. And I guess it always bugged me that as soon as he called me, he told me that they just got their phones and computers back because the police had took them, and they think they're responsible for a person who's missing.
February 20th, 2016, and in Hobart, Indiana, emergency medical services get a call from a woman called Kelly Cochran. Her husband, Jason, had died. She thought that he had taken an overdose of heroin. Walt gets a call too.
So there was a phone call on February 20th, Kelly contacting me to say that Jason had died that night, and immediately my wife told me, well, she did it. And I wasn't really buying that yet. And over the weekend, she was very adamant about the fact that I needed to contact somebody in law enforcement in the Upper Peninsula and tell them that Jason was dead, because it's not even the same state where he died in. And she knew enough about the law to know that they needed to know. So I contacted the FBI and I said I knew Jason and Kelly very good, and they had told me that they were being looked at for this person missing. They have not told me anything about the fact that they did it or anything like that, but I feel that I needed to let you know that one of them died on Saturday, and this is Monday. And right away the guy said, how did Jason die? I said, I didn't even tell you it was Jason. He said, if one of them died, it was Jason. And we need to get on that.
I answered a phone call from the FBI tip line, and they said that they had received an anonymous call, and that we needed to take a closer look at Jason Cochran's death. They said that, you know, it was a possibility that Jason Cochran and Kelly Cochran had been involved in a missing persons case, and that, you know, they had fled to you know, Hobart, Indiana.
And it was within the hour they had the autopsy postponed for that day until the following day so they could get the police there to take part in this autopsy because they understood the importance of it.
The autopsy findings make it clear Jason's was no accidental death. He had died of asphyxia due to strangulation that was complicated by heroin intoxication. A murder investigation is launched.
And I get a call from a detective in Indiana who tells me that Jason Cochran's dead.
2 men dead in 2 states. The common denominator, Kelly Cochran. Her husband Jason was a drug user who had been murdered. As for Chris Reagan, he had now been missing for nearly 2 years. He had a former wife, Terry O'Donnell, and 2 sons who had not heard a word from him.
There was no way that I was ever going to have peace until, you know, I could figure it out. And not only that, but I felt like, you know, I need to give closure to his boys, you know, his family.
Now leading a murder investigation in Indiana, Detective Jeremy Ogden spots the importance of the disappearance of Chris Reagan to the case.
I contacted Chief Frizzo, and she said, I can't believe this has happened. And, you know, she was just, you could tell she was happy that something had occurred. You know, she wasn't happy that somebody was dead, but she was happy that there maybe new life was being put into what she was doing.
It was a relief to me to hear, you know, his thoughts on some of these things because they were my thoughts. It was exactly how I thought. And I had not worked with anyone at that point yet that was on the same track I was. So it was a huge relief.
I was very touched right out of the gate by the whole situation with Chris Reagan. By that time, I had had really good conversations with Laura, and Laura had explained to me, you know, the kind of man that he was, and that he served his country for 20 years in the Navy, and, you know, it was, I don't know, it was important. It was important that somebody go the extra steps for somebody who had always gone and done the right thing for our country.
Ogden heads over with a police photographer to where Kelly was living and where Jason had died. His parents' home.
I'm here to investigate the death of your husband. I said, it's very uncommon for a man at 37 years of age to die, and that's why I'm here today. I kind of got it out there before she had even a reason to ask. And she says, are you here for any other reason? And I said, I don't understand the question. She said, did you come here for another reason? Did you come here to question me about something else? I said, should I be questioning you about something else? I go, this is becoming very odd for me. I said, I'm here to investigate your husband's death. I said, but am I supposed to talk to you about something else? And she says, no, I just was wanting to know, are you sure there's nothing else you came here to talk to me about? And I said, I didn't come here to talk to you about anything other than your husband's untimely death.
It was after Jason's funeral that Detective Ogden called in Kelly Cochran for questioning. A cat and mouse game over 2 states involving teams of investigators and 2 dogged detectives was about to begin as the search was underway to find a killer's mistake.
You asked me if I was there to interview you about anything else. And I said, I really wouldn't be a good detective unless I found out what that other thing was. I said, so I know a little bit about that other thing. I said, but we're not going to talk about that today because I don't want to start a problem between you and I this way. And she kind of smiled and she said, if you want me to respect you at all, you'll just say it like it is. And I said, okay. I said, you know exactly what happened to Chris Reagan. And I said, by the time this is all done, you're going to tell me. And she just sat there and I said, there's no doubt in my mind, you know, I don't have any doubt at all. I 150% know that you know.
Every property where the Cochrans had been was meticulously searched and researched. The basement in their Upper Peninsula home retested forensically for signs of blood. Nothing found. Carpets were taken from the Indiana family home. Nothing conclusive. Hours of interviews between Cochran, Ogden and Chief Frizzo yielded no confession. Detective Ogden decided something creative was needed to get a breakthrough.
I had to find out where Christopher Reagan was disposed of in order for Kelly to confess to killing Jason. And I knew this from the very beginning. I knew that she would never confess to killing Jason unless I somehow got her to admit what happened to Chris Reagan.
Then he told me about his plan to, you know, have this phone call made regarding this fictitious letter that Jason wrote, and he's telling me, you know, we're going to have this friend of Jason's call and say, hey, you know, we have this letter, and Jason told me to mail this out if anything should happen to him to the Iron River Police Department, and he gives me the whole scoop on it.
I had written a script for the letter, and Walt Ammerman was coming that day.
I was very apprehensive. I didn't really think she was going to believe it. He assured me that he could probably get a lawyer to do it in town, a local one, and say Jason contacted him, but he really felt that it would be more believable coming from me.
I sat down with Walt and his wife. I talked to Walt for all of about 5 minutes, and I said, you know, you are the kind of man that every detective hopes walks into his case, and I need you to do something for me. I want you to be my confidential informant.
Really, the ball was in Jeremy's court, and not knowing him that well, but having that feeling that, you know, he was doing the right thing, I just sat back and waited.
Ogden's plan was this. Walt would claim to have a letter given to him by Jason. Kelly Cochran would suspect that the letter would incriminate her in whatever had happened to Chris Reagan, and she would then confess in a plea bargain. Then she would reveal the truth of what had happened to her husband, Jason. Would the ruse work? Could detectives uncover a killer's mistake? A big moment had arrived in the case against Kelly Cochran. The disappearance of her former sex partner, Chris Reagan, last known to have been headed to her home in Iron County, Michigan, remained unsolved. The death of her husband, Jason, from a heroin overdose and asphyxiation had been designated as murder. To get her to confess, a fictitious letter had been dreamed up by investigator Jeremy Ogden, to be revealed by friend to Jason and Kelly Cochran, Walt Ackerman. The letter would imply Jason was going to tell police whatever had happened to Chris Reagan. It was April 2016.
If in the event something occurs to me, if I were to die, please forward this letter to the Iron River Police Department. Attention, Chief Laura Frizzo. Do not open the letter that's contained within this manila envelope, please. And I signed it Jason or whatever, and he said, okay, well, we have to make some changes.
They wanted me to just call her and tell her, but I needed to write it out because I needed to act like I was reading what Jason had wrote me. And if she wanted to hear it again, I wanted to read it exactly like I did the first time. So I wrote it out how I thought he would write it to me.
I said, okay, well, what do we need to change? And he said, well, he would never sign Jason to me. He would sign Quack Quack. He goes, that's what he always called himself to me. I said, okay, so we make it Quack Quack. So, you know, we kind of fine-tuned the letter, and Walt added his 2 cents into it and made it very authentic. And he got on that phone, and it was incredible.
I'll never forget making that phone call. I'll never forget hearing her answer. I just said I had this letter that Jason mailed me and told me to hold on to another letter and said if anything ever happened to him, I needed to send this on to the police in the Upper Peninsula.
And as soon as he said, you know, Jason had sent him this letter, and that in the event something happens to him, to forward it to the Iron River Police Department. There's this huge gasp for air by her.
Her sigh and her cry and her please don't are three things I'll never forget. Please don't. If there was any doubt in my mind that she didn't have something to do with it, it was all erased at that moment.
Ultimately, she says, you know, do whatever you got to do.
And within a minute, she totally flipped and was like, well, you got to do what you got to do.
And the next words are like, don't send it, don't do that, throw it away, whatever it is. But it's to get rid of it. Distance yourself from it, distance me from it. Don't do this to me. And for those 30 seconds, it was like I had the biggest fish of a lifetime on.
I think that was the turning point for her to realize that she wanted to be a witness instead of a suspect. But she was never a witness. She was always the suspect, but I think Jeremy won that game.
And so, for me, the letter worked exactly as it should have, because it opened the door for future conversation about something she was unwilling to talk about. And all of these situations, you have to give them a reason to want to talk to you about this thing that no one else knows, and to share with you the secret that they've been hiding all this time.
In Iron Mountain, Michigan, Chief Laura Frizzo.
He just sent me an email, and I, of course, right away opened the email, and there's a copy of the recording in my email from this phone call. And I thought, obviously it didn't go well, because he would have called and told me. So I'm sitting in my, office, and I opened this recording, and when I listened to it, I just about fell off my chair. And I thought, he got her. If even for a minute, he got her.
Many hours of painstaking interviews later, Kelly Cochran's version of events is finally revealed.
It just got to a point where he was able to, make her vulnerable to the point that she finally told him. I mean, I remember Jeremy calling me and saying, well, she told me that, Jason shot Chris. She finally said, it happened in our house.
Her story was that she and Chris were making out at the top of the stairs when Jason had come across them and then killed Chris with a single rifle shot to the head. So where was his body? When in Jason's parents' house, a brief conversation with Jason's father, Chet, gave the investigation team an idea of what had happened to Chris Reagan's body.
And Chet starts telling me in the interview that Jason would always talk to him about, he called it slicing and dicing, cutting people up and feeding them to the hogs. And if you fed them to the hogs, that nobody would ever be able to figure out what you did. And that he told him there was this prostitute one time that they talked about slicing and dicing her, but that he didn't have any direct information that this happened, but that these were conversations.
Chief Frizzo returns to the neighbours of the Cochrans to be told that those living nearby had heard power tools. They were being used on the early morning of the disappearance of Chris Reagan.
It's like 2:30 in the morning, and they can hear power tools running over at the Cochran residence, describing saws and everything else. And that was really the first time where I kind of sat back and thought, could they possibly have, dismembered this guy?
Kelly Cochran soon confirms the suspicions and agrees to take detectives to the woods where they had buried Chris's body parts.
And within 10 minutes of being there, locate Chris Reagan's skull. Another thing she showed us that day was where she threw the gun, which the Michigan State Police dive team did recover.
Kelly said that they buried him in different garbage bags, and only the skull was found. So the rest of him is there. The rest of him is still missing.
This may have appeared to be an open and shut case, but Kelly Cochran would have her day in court, and a lawyer, a good one.
So the main theme I had was Kelly was basically a liar. and Kelly was seeking attention, and that she would have said anything to get the attention that she wanted, and really there was no proof. There's no forensic evidence behind any of those stories.
The thing I'll never forget is her smirk. She just showed no emotion.
Defense was that there was really no evidence other than Kelly's word as to what happened here, and Kelly was a liar.
The hardest part, I think, was when they brought his skull out as evidence. Just listening to how things went down, luring him into their house. In my mind, how could anybody do that? That's all I kind of had in my mind. How could somebody be so ruthless?
But none were taken in by her defence. Kelly Cochran was found guilty of the murder of Chris Regan, some believing that it had been motivated because of the wedding day pact entered into by the Cochrans.
Their marriage pact was that if one of them had an affair with somebody, they would kill that person, whether it be her or Jason. So if Jason had an affair, the person Jason had an affair with would get killed, and vice versa.
When the jury came back, we were obviously disappointed. Was it surprising? No. There were, again, hundreds of hours of confessions, and the jury obviously believed that some version of that was true.
The moment the fictitious letter fooled Kelly Cochran into revealing that she was hiding the truth had led her to confess first to the murder of Chris Regan and then of the murder of her husband.
Her story is she sat on Jason's chest and held her hands over his nose and mouth as he was trying to throw up from the heroin overdose that she gave him. She wanted him to see her and know that she did that, I think. And I can't wrap my head around that. I don't think any normal person can.
Back in Iron Mountain, the great outdoors still keeps its secrets. After the discovery of his skull, nothing else was found of the remains of Chris Regan.
These are the woods where he was buried. I'm got shivers, not because of the cold, just because of where I am right now. When I came out here on October 14th for Chris's 5-year anniversary of his death, I just got chills, and I could feel him, and it was just real eerie. And knowing that he's still, parts of him are still not found.
In May 2017, Kelly Cochran was sentenced to life in prison without parole at a hearing in Iron County Court in Michigan. Cochran was found guilty of murder, larceny, conspiracy to commit dead bodies, concealing the death of an individual, and lying to a police officer. In May 2018, she accepted a sentence of 65 years as part of a plea deal for the 2016 murder of her husband, Jason, in Hobart.